Very good morning to you. Welcome to Breakfast with Dan Walker and Louise Minchin.
Headlines for you at 6 o'clock this morning. Downing Street braces itself for explosive revelations from the Prime Minister's former right-hand man as MPs quiz Dominic Cummings about the government's handling of the pandemic.
New guidance for people living in 8 coronavirus hotspots in England. They are now advised to minimise travel.
1 minute they tell you one thing and then the next minute you look on the government website and they're telling you something completely different.
More than 1 million households need more help with water bills. Good morning. The Consumer Watchdog calls for payments for people in financial difficulty to be capped. I'll bring you the details.
Manchester United are in the Europa League final tonight. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is aiming for his first trophy as the club's manager. Villarreal stand in their way.
It's the school charity concert with a showbiz twist. Music legends send in video messages introducing their greatest hits.
Hi, it's Mick Jagger here. I'd like to wish everyone at Hutchinson's all the best for your concert. Hope you enjoy the music.
Good morning. Today we've still got some rain in the forecast, but as we go through the next few days, the weather's going to settle down. It's going to turn warmer and drier with more of us seeing some sunshine. I'll have all the details coming up later in the programme.
Good morning. It's Wednesday. It's the 26th of May and the Prime Minister's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, is appearing in front of MPs later today to answer questions about the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic.
He's expected to criticise the actions taken, particularly around the decision not to toughen up restrictions last autumn. But MPs are likely to question his own choice to travel to Barnard Castle in the spring. Here's our political correspondent, Helen Catt. And just to warn you, her report does contain some flashing images.
It was a year ago that one of the Prime Minister's most senior behind-the-scenes advisers found himself in the spotlight. This was Dominic Cummings taking the highly unusual step of giving a press conference in the garden of Downing Street after he made a trip from London to Durham while England was in its first lockdown. It included a drive to Barnard Castle, he said, to test his eyesight before heading home.
The whole point was, I had been extremely ill. My vision had been a bit weird. We were all going to go back. My wife said we should drive down the road and you should see if you can actually drive and see if your vision is weird or if you're okay. And I thought that's a good idea, I should do.
Today he will be quizzed again, but this time it'll be MPs asking the questions in their own look at the lessons learnt from the pandemic so far. Mr Cummings appeared before one committee back in March. Then he described the Department of Health as a smoking ruin in terms of procurement and PPE. It's expected today's evidence will also be highly critical of the government. In a series of tweets over recent days, he made a number of claims about its handling of the pandemic. He claimed that secrecy at the start had contributed greatly to the catastrophe. He said the government's plans had been part disaster, part non-existent. And he claimed that the official plan had originally been to allow the virus to spread to reach herd immunity, which ministers deny. It's expected that he will also criticise the Prime Minister's attitude towards bringing back restrictions last September. Downing Street said that throughout this pandemic, the government's priority had been to save lives, protect the NHS and support people's jobs and livelihoods across the United Kingdom. Dominic Cummings left Number 10 in November last year. Up to that point, he'd been one of the few people who'd been in the room when many of the big decisions of the pandemic were taken. He wasn't just an observer, but he's certainly become a critic. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
A busy day today then. Let's speak to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Adam, good morning to you. Once a staunch ally of the Prime Minister, there's I suppose a fear in Number 10 that it could be a really damaging day for Boris Johnson and the government.
Yeah, and one of Dominic Cummings' friends say that his intention is not to get revenge here, and that may not be the intention, but it might end up being the result after the 4 hours of evidence we're probably going to see him giving to MPs today. And thanks to that very long Twitter thread that he's done, we've got quite a good idea of what he's going to say over those 4 hours. He'll be criticising the government's strategy, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when the virus was first emerging in China. He will criticise the structures in the government and just how the civil service and ministers actually operate on a daily basis in a crisis. And we know he will criticise the Prime Minister personally, especially when it comes to that debate they were having at the top of government about when to introduce a second lockdown. I also think he'll make some comments about some phrases that the Prime Minister might have used in the heat of the moment in those debates. Now, whether you like him or don't like him, and many people in Westminster do not like Dominic Cummings, you've got to listen to what he says, because he's a very compelling character and he was in the room at the time. But also he's got lots of questions to answer himself, not least that trip to Barnard Castle and what it did to public trust in the government at a crucial moment in the crisis.
OK, that's something we'll be discussing throughout the morning for you.
Thank you. The government has updated its guidance for 8 areas worst affected by the Indian COVID variant of coronavirus to make it clearer that it's not imposing local restrictions.
This follows a day of confusion yesterday when the official advice had been to avoid travel if possible.
So let's get an update from our reporter Geeta Pense, who's in Leicester, which is subject to the new guidance. And Geeta, what have people told you there about the changing guidance?
Yes, morning. Well, there was a lot of confusion and frustration here in Leicester, which was amongst those 8 council areas listed in guidance that was published on Friday that no one seemed to be aware of. And in it, the government advised people to avoid travelling in and out of the affected areas unless it was essential. And that triggered a lot of alarm bells with local councils who said they were unaware of travel restrictions and wanted clarification. Now, as you say, that clarification did come much later in the day, and the government are now advising people to minimise travel in and out of the areas and that there are no local restrictions. But it did cause a lot of chaos. So here in Leicester, I've spoken to business owners, a restaurant owner who said that they'd seen cancellations, people in the city worried about the effect on trade, but also many people who were planning breaks over the half term or over the bank holiday, wondering what they should do. Now, after that clarification, the Director of Public Health here in Leicester said that the confused messaging had been very unhelpful and had caused a lot of difficulty in the area. And as you may remember, Leicester was the first city to go into a localised lockdown last year, and there is very little appetite for it. The advice at the moment is to stick with national guidelines, and the government say they're trying to help people take extra precautions, but it is advice and there are no localised restrictions at the moment.
Thank you very much. And we'll speak to you later. Thank you.
People aged 30 and 31 in England are now being offered a first dose of a COVID vaccine. They'll start receiving invitations to book their jab from today. Nearly 3/4 of adults in the UK have already had 1 dose, and more than 2/5 have had 2.
The girlfriend of the journalist and activist Roman Protasevich, who was detained with him when their flight was forced to land in Belarus, has appeared in an apparent confession video. In the footage, Sofia Sapiga admits to releasing information on Belarusian security forces, but appears to be speaking under duress.
The family of George Floyd met with President Joe Biden 1 year after he was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis. During their meeting, President Biden reiterated a promise to Mr. Floyd's family to push through a bill for police reform, which has stalled in Congress. Memorials for George Floyd took place throughout the United States.
The Foreign Secretary has arrived in Israel for talks aimed at upholding the ceasefire between the country's military and Hamas militants. Dominic Raab is expected to stress the UK's commitment to a 2-state solution, where he meets both the Israeli Prime Minister and the Palestinian President on the 1-day visit. It comes 5 days after an Israel-Gaza ceasefire was declared following an upsurge of deadly violence in the region.
Quite a few people have been out on a bike over lockdown, but it may be a while before you can have a go at this. Well, no way. Oh, I'm sure we've got another angle on this. It's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Oh, it looks such fun. This is Bienvenido Aguado, who's completed the biggest mountain bike front flip in history. He's just flying, isn't he? He jumped 30 metres. The previous record was a mere 21. He was taking part in a cycling event, and you can see from the background, in South Africa.
Do we have to say that thing where we say don't try this at home?
I mean,
I don't think it'd be stupid enough.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.